It is an overcast morning in June, and the world is at war. Boatloads of British soldiers and American Rangers are racing towards a French beach to make an assault landing against a strongly fortified enemy position. If they win, it will decisively turn the war in Britain's favor. It's the 8th of June, 1758, and James Wolfe is about to storm the beaches at Louisbourg. Will it be the start of an illustrious military career? Or do the paths of glory lead but to the grave? Find out today on The Die is Cocked. Not again. Hello, I'm Bruce. Welcome to the basement. In days of yore from Britain's shore, Wolfe the dauntless hero came and planted firm Britannia's flag on Canada's fair domain. These are the opening lines of the Maple Leaf Forever, a Canadian patriotic song. James Wolfe is best known today for his victory at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which led to the capture of Quebec by the British Army. But his first experience of war in North America came the year before the fall of Quebec, at the Siege of Louisbourg. In 1758, the French and Indian War, the North American phase of the 7 Years' War, was in its fourth year and still going France's way. But in that year, William Pitt the Elder, Britain's leader of the House of Commons, devised a strategy to turn the tide of the war in Britain's favour. Pitt's plan called for a three-pronged attack on France's possessions in North America. In the west, General Forbes was to capture Fort Duquesne, modern Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the forks of the Ohio. Meanwhile, General Abercrombie was to secure Lake Champlain and the Champlain Valley by capturing the French Fort Carillon at Ticonderoga. Finally, Sir Geoffrey Amherst would sail from Halifax and capture the fortress of Louisbourg on Ile Royale, modern Cape Breton. If Louisbourg fell quickly, Amherst's force was then to proceed up the St. Lawrence River and capture Quebec. Once these initial objectives were secured, the British armies in North America would march on Montreal from 3 directions, completing the conquest of Canada. Of course, it was possible for a British fleet to proceed against Quebec and bypass Louisbourg entirely. However, doing so would be a very risky move. Louisbourg's harbour was large enough to serve as a base for the entire French fleet, and a French squadron operating out of Louisbourg could trap a British fleet in the St. Lawrence River. Caught between the citadel of Quebec and the French fleet, the British force would almost certainly be destroyed. Therefore, Louisbourg had to be taken if Canada was to fall. Amherst's force consisted of around 12,000 soldiers and another 14,000 sailors. Louisbourg had fallen to a much smaller force of New England militia in 1745, so Amherst was confident his regulars could do the job. But first, he had to get them ashore. Amherst's force arrived in Gabarus Bay, off Louisbourg, on June 1, 1758. For the next week, it bobbed in the rough seas off the coast, while Amherst considered the best place to send his men ashore. One possible spot, and one which the French would not expect, was Lorembec, to the northeast of the fortress. However, the beach here was small, and the surf was always rough, so it was no place for a landing. A better beach was to be found at White Point. However, it lay within range of the guns of the fortress, and so was also a suboptimal place to come ashore. The best landing spot was at the Anse à la Coromandieres, known to the English as Freshwater Cove. This was where the New Englanders had come ashore in 1745. With its broad, flat beach, perfect for landing longboats laden with troops and supplies, Amherst knew that this was the best spot to establish a beachhead. The trouble was, the French knew that Amherst knew that Anse à la Coromandieres was the best place to make a landing, and so they fortified it very heavily. But Amherst knew that the French knew that he knew that Anse à la Coromandieres was the best landing spot, and knew they would post troops there, so he decided to land at Flat Point instead. This would enable his troops to cut the defenders of Anse à la Coromandieres off from the fortress. But the French knew that Amherst knew that they knew that he knew that Anse-la-Coramondière was the best place to land, and so might try a landing somewhere else, and so they fortified all the potential landing places. On the morning of June 8th, the sea was finally calm enough to attempt an assault landing, except at Flat Point, Amherst's preferred landing spot, where the sea was still rough. So Amherst decided to land at heavily defended Anse-la-Coramondière after all. Command of the landing force was given to Brigadier General James Wolfe, the youngest and most energetic of Amherst's 3 brigadiers. Wolfe had previously seen action at Culloden and during a disastrous descent on the French coast. The siege of Louisbourg was to be his first test in command of a large body of troops. His landing force, the Red Division, consisted of around 3,000 men. Wolfe's assault force was made up of the cream of the British Army. In the first wave were the grenadier companies from most of the British regiments participating in the siege. His second wave consisted of 500 light infantrymen and around 500 American Rangers, including 2 companies of the famed Rogers Rangers. The men of the 78th Fraser's Highlanders, armed with muskets and claymores, formed the third wave. In longboats and barges, these men would land in the teeth of enemy fire and secure the beachhead. The beach was defended by a little over 1,000 men. The defenders consisted of the bulk of the 2nd Battalions of the Artois and Bourgogne regiments, plus some of the Louisbourg militia. They were supported by a reserve of approximately 150 men of the Compagnie Franche de la Marine, and about 60 of France's Mi'kmaq allies. They also had 4 6-pound guns and a 24-pounder. These are how the forces translated into our game using the Regimental Fire and Fury rules. The French had dug trenches and gun positions all along the beach and placed felled trees to form an abattis in front of their position. From their boats, the British could not make out the well-camouflaged French defences and had no idea where, or how many, were the enemy. Wolfe's plan was simple. Some of the lighter ships, like the sloop HMS Kennington, would run in close to shore and blast the beach, and then the British longboats would go straight in. Today, Anse-la-Coramondière is known as Kennington Cove, named after HMS Kennington. At the same time, feints would be made at Flat Point and White Point, and even at Lorenbec, to try to confuse the French about the real landing site. But the French were not fooled. For today's game, we will be using Regimental Fire and Fury with a few modifications. For example, troops in the trenches and gun positions cannot run out of ammunition due to the stockpiles collected there, whereas troops outside of the trenches who run low on ammunition cannot resupply, unless they capture a trench. The French place counters on the table, including dummy counters, to represent where their units might be. They do not have to reveal them until they fire. Rod will play James Wolfe in today's game. He will be the overall commander, as well as commanding the combined grenadier companies. Howard will play Lieutenant Colonel George Scott of the 40th Foot, commanding the British light infantry companies, 2 companies of Rogers Rangers, and 1 company each of Gorham's and Danks Rangers. Perry will be Wolfe's second in command, Major Alexander Murray, leading the 4 boatloads of the 78th Highlanders. Eric will play Colonel Saint-Julien, commander of the Artois Regiment, and overall commander of the beach defences. Paul will play Griot de Poilly, an engineering officer who helped plan the defences. These are the French starting positions. They start hidden so the British cannot see them and have no idea there are any cannon. Historically, the French placed their 24-pounder and the Micmac on the right by the hill, but our defenders today have chosen a slightly different setup. Here is the sight that greets the British players as Rod draws up his plans for the assault. Rod has also chosen a slightly different plan than the real Wolfe. He will go in first with the Grenadiers, as Wolfe did historically. But then the Highlanders will come in second, whereas historically they were in the third wave. And Howard will land third with the Lights and Rangers. Instead of massing at one point, Rod will attack the beaches en echelon, counting on the French not being able to defend every place at once. Historically, the volume of fire from the French defenders was so great that Wolfe ordered his boats to retreat. However, 2 or 3 boats found a small, rocky cove that the French had failed to defend. Wolfe and a few men managed to get ashore here, and then attacked the left flank of the French defences. Afraid of being cut off from the fortress, the French broke and ran, and Wolfe's force got ashore. This is where Wolfe and his band got ashore historically. Today, it's known as Wolfe's Cove. There's a chance the British will notice this undefended cove each turn and be able to land there. If they don't see it, it will be straight onto the beach and abattis for them. The game begins with Wolfe's 3 boats coming straight in at the French right flank. Paul unmasks his 24-pounder and fires, but misses with a 2. Rod comes closer. Paul has moved his Micmac onto a bluff to flank any British who land, and fires again with his 24-pounder. Again he misses. Paul has clearly decided to roll like me this game. Perry brings on the boats containing Fraser's Highlanders. Eric rolls high with his 6-pounders and causes heavy casualties amongst the Scots. The boats carrying the Grenadiers come ashore. Wolfe, in the bow, prepares to jump onto the beach, but Paul's 24-pounder is waiting, and it's due for a hit. Paul rolls an overdue 10. Not only do the Grenadiers suffer casualties, but the boat is considered to be holed just before it lands. The Grenadiers on board are pitched into the ocean. They manage to wade ashore, but their powder is soaked, and this unit will be low on ammo for the rest of the game. Meanwhile, the 78th row furiously to get closer to shore and out of the firing arc of Eric's guns. But as you can see, they have a long way to go, and Eric's cannonballs continue to wreak havoc on the tightly packed ranks of Highlanders. The trenches, meanwhile, are eerily quiet. Where are the French infantry? There they are! As the first boats of Highlanders reach the beach, the Bourgogne regiment pops up and gives them a volley. Welcome to Cape Breton! More boats prepare to land behind them. On the British right flank, the boats containing Howard's command have come on the table. Incredibly, the British have failed to spot the secret landing cove every turn. They're going to have to do this the hard way, and Paul and Eric fire at them with devastating effect. Wolfe leads his Grenadiers through the abattis, only to have the Artois regiment appear and open fire on him. The Grenadiers form a firing line and exchange volleys with the Artois, who are supported by canister from the 24-pounder. Wolfe has attached himself to one of the units of Grenadiers. A high die roll from Paul could very well kill him. It's a bold move by Rod that could have tragic results. At the top of the picture, you can see that the unit of Grenadiers, with the wet powder, is about to march into the woods in column. Paul's Micmac fire on them. With a cheer, the British Grenadiers charge the entrenchments with the bayonet. In the rules, elite troops like the Grenadiers can both fire on a charge and claim the cold steel benefit in melee, which makes them all but unstoppable. Perry's Highlanders have also disembarked and are moving on the enemy trenches. As they advance, they trade volleys with the Bourgogne. The 78th caused disorder amongst the Bourgogne, but on the left, you can see that French musketry and canister have caused heavy losses amongst the Grenadiers. Rod and Paul check the charts to determine the factors to be used in the melee. Rod has a slight advantage in the modifiers. In the melee between the Grenadiers and the Artois, Rod has the advantage. However, he rolls a 2 against Paul's 9, and the British are driven back. Colonel Simon Fraser and the colour party of the 78th have come ashore. Everywhere, Rod's attack en echelon is developing as planned. Howard's boatloads of lights and rangers are almost to the beach, and then disaster happens. Wolfe is dead. He has fallen in the melee with the Artois. The French have gone back and looked at the melee chart, and triumphantly announced that they had rolled a 9, and so have killed our Dauntless hero in combat. Perhaps leading from the front wasn't such a good idea after all. But it turns out that the French have been looking at the wrong chart. Reports of Wolfe's death have been greatly exaggerated. He is alive and kicking, and is not about to die in battle, yet. The battle could go either way. The French reserves have occupied the trench, and volleys of musketry roll along the opposing lines, punctuated by the reports of the French cannon. The Bourgogne regiment stands firm as the Highlanders prepare to charge. Rod's waterlogged grenadiers attempt to charge Paul's Micmac in the woods, but just end up getting lost. The Micmac have seen enough, however, and exit the table. Lieutenant Colonel Scott disembarks with his light infantry and rangers, straight in front of Eric's 6-pounders. Eric opens fire with his guns, and bloody gaps are torn in Howard's lines. The British army will break if they lose 17 stands, and they're starting to get close. The 78th fire at the Bourgogne and disorder them, while Howard's light infantry also fire. The Highlanders also charge the men of the Compagnie Franche de la Marine in the trench. This will be an important die roll for both sides, and Perry's advantages in numbers and having the charging bonus are balanced by Eric's trenches. Perry rolls an 8 to Eric's 2, and Fraser's Highlanders destroy the French. Paul cries as British troops are now in the French entrenchments. Howard looks at the charts to see if he can repeat Perry's performance. Based on his previous repulse, Wolfe knows that taking the French trenches will be difficult, but our dauntless hero is undaunted by this daunting task, and he leads his grenadiers back into the fray. Braving canister and musketry, the grenadiers charge. Paul rolls like me, and the British do not lose a man as they charge home. The ensuing melee is tense. Wolfe is victorious, and the Artois are thrown out of the trenches. Rod takes his men into the trench line. Most of the trench has now fallen to the attackers. Now only the Bourgogne and the Louisbourg militia remain in the trench line, but Perry plans to change that. Paul knows that the French have to control the trenches to win the game. With the grenadiers still disordered from their successful assault, now is the time to throw them out. He charges with the Artois. Rod's ragged volleys fail to stop Paul's charge, and the French go in with the bayonet. The battle could go either way, but the stalwart grenadiers hold, and the French are driven off. Perry draws Fraser's Highlanders up for an assault on the Bourgogne. Pipes skirling, the 78th make their wild charge on the entrenchments. The brave Scots are unstoppable. The Highlanders take the position. Howard sends his light infantry and Roger's Rangers against Eric's 6-pounders. Eric blasts them with canister. But still they come on. A furious melee breaks out between the light troops and the gunners, but Howard rolls a 1 and the redoubt holds. The British are thrown back in disarray. Meanwhile, Rod launches his grenadiers out of the trenches into a charge against what's left of the Artois regiment. The French are destroyed. Fraser's Highlanders have destroyed the Bourgogne regiment. Only a handful of Louisbourg militia remain in the French works. Howard charges the redoubt again. His light infantry engage one of the 6-pounders, and it is destroyed. With Gorham's and Dank's Rangers bearing down on Eric's last gun, this turn has seen the French force almost completely destroyed. Rod, our dauntless hero for today, is victorious, and the British army can now come ashore and begin the siege. I would not recommend Gabarus Bay as a landing place to anyone, Wolfe later wrote, and in our game the British lost 14 stands of men, just 3 stands short of their army breakpoint, so it was a near-run thing. Louisbourg fell after a 7-week siege, largely due to the energetic efforts of James Wolfe. Its gallant French defenders held out long enough, however, to prevent a British attack on Quebec in 1758. Wolfe led the British attack on Quebec the next year, and at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, he defeated a French army to win Canada for Britain. The night before the battle, Wolfe quoted from his favourite poem, Elegy written in a country churchyard, in a meeting with his officers. The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. He then said, Gentlemen, I had rather written those lines than conquered Quebec. At the battle, the French player rolled a 9 on the right chart, and for James Wolfe, the paths of glory did indeed lead but to the grave. But that's a story and a war game for another day. Well, that's it for now. Thanks to Rod for his dauntless portrayal of James Wolfe, and thanks to all of you for joining me in the basement. Until next time, may your dice always roll true.